Um, this first lecture is basically on career theory. At home, I'm not going to share my screen, but if you want, you can pull up the notes and follow along if you want to. And here in class, I don't have to share the Zoom screen in order for you all to see the notes. So when we're thinking about the historical context of career theory, there's a few terms that have some subtle differences. Career refers to positions and lifetime work. Career counseling, all counseling activities associated with career choices over a lifespan, and career guidance encompasses all components of services like educational institutions, agencies, others that offer counseling and career-related education programs. Let's talk about the first one here, career. So the big differentiation is a career is different than a job, okay? So let's talk about some of those differences. When we talk about a job, it may be just something that we want to do to pay bills, to meet our life needs, and it may not be what we want to do permanently in our lives. It may be a stepping stone into a career. It may be something we're doing while we're in school, getting an education or getting trained to do something that we hope to do for a longer period of time. So remember last week when I talked about transcending dichotomies. That's the ideal, okay? So remember, like, the two dichotomies, the two opposites. We've got careers and we've got fun, happiness, meaning, fulfillment, things like that. And we want our career to come as close as we can to our personal meaning and fulfillment and enjoying life, because we're going to be working at a job many hours a week for many weeks during our lives for many years. Here's the thing. I've gotten so many clients throughout my my career as a counselor that they've worked in a certain area, a certain career, and they thought, hey, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. And there's lots of reasons people do that. Maybe somebody recommended, hey, this is a great career, or maybe it provided some pretty good financial situations or benefits. Maybe they thought, this is what I was meant to do. This is, where I'm meant to be. And yet, for whatever reason, either the financial benefits or the career itself wasn't providing the meaning and fulfillment that they had hoped for. Okay, so I've had people who have been in a career 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Maybe they've retired, but they retired at an age that's young enough that they could still do something else. So there's no age for this life change. All right, people go through this at all different times in their lives, but some of the words, some of the language that they use when they talk with me is that first of all, they normally tell me all of the great benefits and how successful they are. So maybe they work their way up to upper management, or maybe they, got to a certain place financially in their lives. But for some reason, they didn't feel fulfilled, even though they had those societally recognized successes in life. So they wanted to make a change in their life. Now, as a therapist, normally, we look at all different parts of their lives, not just career. So we look at their relationships, and like in skills, we talked about, okay, well, do they have a significant other? What's that relationship like? What was their relationship growing up with their parents or guardians? Are they still alive? What's their current relationship with them? Do they have any kids? What's their relationship like with that? Do they have friendships? What's those relationships like? What's their relationship like with people where they do work? So we talk about relationships as a domain, and then we look at career as another domain, and career usually goes along with education, but some people are no longer in going to school. And then the third domain is, are they doing physically? And that's a pretty broad picture. Maybe they were in an accident, maybe they have some health issues, what's going on in that area of their life. So, but those are the three big domains. If one of those domains isn't going well, that creates a significant amount of stress in somebody's life. And it could be any one of those three domains. If two of those domains aren't going well, then individuals have a difficult time functioning at a positive level. And it may result in anxiety and depression and things like that. So when we're going to talk more about this process, but that's usually what's going on when people tell me about their career or wanting to make a change. And I just need to say, look at all of the domains in someone's life, not just career. Career is a significant part of somebody's life. So the second thing, career counseling, that leads us from what's the difference between a job and a career to, so hopefully, my goal is to help them to find meaning and fulfillment when they go to work every day. I want them to get to a point where they look forward to going to work, but they also have to have a balance. Sometimes people spend all their time at work, okay? And people have different reasons for that. But it's important to have a balance between those areas, those three big domains. So work, all of the different types of relationships in our lives, and when we talk about physical, that also means taking care of yourself emotionally and physically, okay? Being healthy yourself. So we want to balance between those three domains in our lives. So career counseling, one of the problems I see in a lot of career counseling is that so many times people go and they take all of the assessments that you're all going to take, and yet the career counselor doesn't get into all of these other areas of their lives. They just focus on the assessments and the one domain of career, okay? Well, I mean, it's important, but we have to consider all the domains. And when you graduate, if you decided to do career counseling, one of the things that I thought helped me to be a a good career counselor is I talked about all the areas of their life, you know, how they're all interrelated. If I was in a career that was extremely stressful and took up a majority of my time, that's going to affect my health, my emotions, and my relationships. So we really need to figure out what's going on, and along with assessments and talking with people about what's important to them. In our second lecture tonight, we're going to be talking about trait and all kinds of different things. And that's basically matching up our personalities and abilities with kind of the personality of a career and the ability one needs in order to be successful in that career. Okay, and career guidance, that's basically, you know, this process that we're just starting to talk about. So as we move into early history and vocational guidance, so before it was called career counseling, it was called vocational guidance. Now, one of the reasons why career counseling is such an important part of the comps and the NCE, and you've got an entire class on it, is that in the very beginning of counseling, the whole focus was on. So think about it this way: when people started going to maybe a K through 12 school, the whole goal of getting them through school was to prepare them for an occupation. Okay, now we're much more balanced, we're more well-rounded, but that was the goal back then, so that students could graduate and get a job. So most of the counseling that went on in schools began with careers. It was the priority of counseling in the very beginning. It's not that way anymore. So vocational guidance started in England prior to the Industrial Revolution. So change was ignited due to agricultural failures such as the potato famine, making provisions, previous safe jobs unstable, led to many to migrate to the United States, as well as industry jobs that were increasing. So let's talk about this period of time, okay? We're talking about very early on in the history of our nation, and beginning in England. But when we think about time periods, we're thinking about cities growing in the United States, which was still very young at that point. There is still a lot of social conflicts going on back then. There's a lot of inequality, there's a lot of judgment and prejudice, and for any person that's immigrating from another country, beyond racial discrimination. So, for instance, the potato famine, the United States got a huge number of individuals because people were starving in Ireland. And yet, if we look at our history, even though that one population really did so much for the growth of our nation, they were treated horribly when they first arrived. And you can pick any nation that was struggling at that point. People were looking for a new start. And so a lot of things were happening at the same time. And another thing that was happening was, okay, so in the United States, there was a lot of land, a lot of expansion, and you can talk about all of the cultural implications, which are 9 times out of 10 horrible. When we talk about, all of the prejudice and the end to slavery, and still how everybody was treated with prejudice, and Native Americans, and taking over all of that land with expansionism and eminent domain. And there's a lot of negative things going on in our nation. So be aware of that. But, a lot of those things, like the possibility of starting a farm. And even though that land was available because of a very negative thing, like moving Native Americans off of that land, the reason people were coming was their farms failed. They wanted to start over again in a new land. Another thing that was happening was the Industrial Revolution. And this is probably the thing I want to focus the most on in this time period. So many people prior to the Industrial Revolution were either farmers and worked with agriculture, or they learned by becoming an apprentice. Okay, so when you think about apprenticeships, somebody would learn to create a product by working with an expert in that field of production. But they would create a product from beginning to end. So some things that the Industrial Revolution changed was, first of all, you no longer had to create things the same way. So they had invented, steam power, and then they invented, power that was didn't need coal, but you could create heat and smelting with oil or gas, or there's a multiple ways to create energy at that point that would run the factories. The other thing is, a person no longer had to learn how to create a product from beginning to end. So the very beginning of the assembly line was invented at this point, and an individual only had to learn one skill that was very centralized. So maybe they only had to learn how to create a wheel for a car. They didn't have to learn the whole process of manufacturing. They only had to learn how to create one component, or to take one component and install it into a larger product. So people no longer had to go through a long-term apprenticeship, okay, in order to get a job. There were some negatives, lots of negatives as well. So children were working in factories. People were getting killed in factories because of a lack of safety precautions. There were so many people working in factories that labor was cheap. These people were still living on the edge of poverty, And it was very hard to break out of this cycle of poverty. They were working very long hours, and yet most of them saw it as being better than perhaps coming from a location like Ireland where they were literally starving. That doesn't mean it was okay. You know, I'm not saying any of this was okay. I'm just kind of pointing out the changes during this time. So when we think about this, you know, the big shift is from agriculture and apprenticeships to, you know, a job that can be learned, or a person could be trained in a very short amount of time. So after the Industrial Revolution, labor-intensive jobs became available, abundant, hot demand. There are only three ways to truly get ahead, to break out of this cycle. Coming from a wealthy family that was already established, going to school, or undertaking an apprenticeship in an area that had not been industrialized. So apprenticeships were still available, but they were highly specialized. And they were declining in numbers as well. So anytime somebody invented a way to create a product more easily using, at that time, modern methods, that apprenticeship was gone. So three inventions that influenced the Industrial Revolution: steam power, later replaced by electricity, gas, oil, railway systems for transportation, and the assembly line, which is probably the most important one. As we go through the various theories, a lot of these things, like mentorships and apprenticeships, are coming back again. It's a fantastic thing, and I think, but you know, as we move through these different career theories, I'll talk about how apprenticeships fit in with this more modern world that we live in. Let's see. So before this time period, only the wealthy went to school. There are some exceptions, like there were a lot of one-room schoolhouses, and children could be sent to school. The average was not 12 grades. So I think that something else that was happening around this time was that schools became more common, and many individuals had more of an opportunity to go to school. And there were many people who were still marginalized. You know, I know that as well. But when we're looking at the big pictures, more than just the wealthy could go to school. And that was one way to get out of this cycle. An interesting thing, near the end of the 1800s, so I would say like 1860s to the end of the 1800s, 1900s. So for those 50 years, a number of women's colleges were founded. Most of them were connected with some religious organization, but so Chatham College was one of the first women's colleges in this area, and it remained a women's college up until a few years ago. But it was started by Shadyside Presbyterian Church, in the late 1800s. And they chose areas around, it's all started on the northeast coast. So another one would be Wilson College, that's in central Pennsylvania. I'm sure you can think of some on your own. This added, an opportunity for some women that had not been there previously. Most of these colleges started out as teaching colleges, and they increased their opportunities over the years. So in 1856, Cambridge and Oxford increased their career support for students. So we're back to England, helping them to find some employment. Appointment boards acted as an early career center. Secretaries served as advisors, tracked student histories. Cambridge was first school with a women's appointment board, though it was unofficial until 1948, almost 100 years later. Okay, so that's kind of the very first step in our change in the way we look at careers and jobs. But there's a number of different things that occurred, and the next three things happened one right after another in the early 1900s. So we had World War I, and then we had the Depression, and then we had World War II. And those were three significant things when we talk about career counseling. So, let's see. Let me give you a couple names before we get up to the wars. And I included these names. They're important, but it's important that you memorize who they are. All right. So as I went through, as we wrote this chapter in the book, we also thought about what would you need to pass the comps and the NCE. And then once we put it in the notes, these notes are really a study guide for those exams. So I wouldn't highlight certain things. You need to memorize the notes, basically. There's no part of the notes. I wrote down with Nate, a previous GA, basically whatever we thought might be on the exam. Okay, so Jane Addams created the Hall House, the first settlement house. Men would live in houses together for working, regardless of social class. Many were introduced to the higher life, better life. Hall House grew and added a women's section due to the interest in women's labor issues. Social class gaps started to be bridged, and people were being helped move into better careers regardless of their social class. She was the vice president of the American Woman Suffrage Association. So basically, women wanted the ability, the right to vote, and she was one of the founders of that. Okay, another big name. If you've had some educational background, you'll probably recognize Frank Parsons. 1908, the term vocational guidance was coined, distinguished counseling as an entity distinct from its roots in social work. In 1909, he wrote a book called Choosing a Vocation, and that's probably the most significant early work on career counseling. He did work with YMCA, founded the Vocational Bureau in Boston, and the Civil Service House. So here we've moved basically from England to Boston and New York City, which were hubs on the East Coast of the United States. Parson followed Jane Addams' footsteps in the emphasis on the importance of the settlement house and the work with the Civic Service House in Boston. Instrumental in establishing the National Vocational Guidance Association and the National Career Development Association, and those became the ACA career associations today. Harvard took over the Vocational Bureau after Parsons passed away. So he came up with his own vocational theory, and even though it's very basic, it's the grounds for a lot of the theories that we're going to continue to talk about over the next few weeks. And this is one of the first times in career theory that we begin to talk about traits. Traits in human beings and traits in careers. So an individual needed to match his or her own personal traits to career traits. And if we came up with a good match, not only would they be successful in that career, but they would enjoy it more as well. They would find it more fulfilling. So the Smith Hughes Act of 1917, so this was later rehashed and called trait factor theory. Smith Hughes Act of 1917 established guidance counseling in schools. So if you look at these years, this was not that long ago, and yet they're just beginning this process. Established guidance counseling in the schools, Smith Hughes Act, was followed by a series of legislation supporting vocational education in the public schools. And remember, this isn't general school counseling. This is really how do we help our students to get a job when they graduate, to find a career when they graduate. So it's really very specific. So around that same time, so Smith Hughes Act was 1917. Biggest surges in aptitude testing were 1917 and 1939, aptitude testing. So those 2 years coincide with the beginning of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War. So what was happening was so many people were signing up to the military or being drafted that they didn't know where to put them. They knew, oh, well, if this person was a mechanic, I don't want to just throw them into some other part of the military. I want them to work on our vehicles, okay? So they knew everybody had certain aptitudes. Maybe they had some previous training or experience. How are we going to put them in the right place? Now, when you take your class on assessment, you're also going to learn about Alfred Binet, IQ testing, all of that. That was also combined with aptitude, but IQ is different than aptitude, okay? But you'll learn about, Binet and the IQ tests. We're going to talk about career aptitude testing. And so initially, U.S. government wanted to know which drafted soldiers would be best for which roles. Are they going in the infantry? Are they going to be a cook, an engineer, a mechanic? Where are we going to put all these people to best meet the needs of the military, but to also be a good fit for that soldier? And this was a way of sorting people based on aptitude testing. We still use aptitude testing when people decide to go into the military. And I'll talk about this later, but you can take the ASVAB, ASVAB, and that will help them decide where you would go or how you would be trained in the military. All right, so that was really the beginning of serious aptitude testing and assessments. Jesse Buttrick Davis brought vocational guidance into school settings in 1980. 85 seems pretty recent. Wrote The Eyes Were Open to Occupation. Yeah, I'm guessing that was a lot. I'm guessing it was 1895. That's my guess. I'll have to check that. If you got a phone, look up Jesse Buttrick Davis and see what the year was. But I'm guessing it's a typo. Okay, vocational guidance was not known at that time. Developed first president of Vocational College. All right.
It's
So let's.
definitely a typo because he died in 1955.
So then it's got it. They had to mix up the 9 and the 8. I'm guessing it's 1895. All right. 3 steps for career choice: self-knowledge, knowing about ourselves, what information we have about possibilities, and career choice. Let's see. All right, this continues this. So 3 areas of career counseling: Industrial Revolution, I would say World War I and World War II, and current technology, the age of instability. So there are more eras than that in career technology, but those are pretty big ones. Let's see. Technology's greatest impact was that it ended a number of careers. New inventions made old careers obsolete, but that always happens with any technological advancement. So for instance, during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of jobs were lost, but a lot of jobs were created. 30% of the old careers are now dead, despite being long since established. New careers were created, but new technology didn't require the type of workers who lost their jobs. New workers could learn to use technological programs or technology programs. Many older Americans experienced difficulty with this. The creation industry has also wildly changed thanks to robotics. New technology impacted both creation that's tangible and information, which is less tangible, jobs. So I think that so I talked about the first thing I hear from some clients, that they're not fulfilled in their career. Something is out of balance. They're not finding meaning in their life. The second thing I hear from clients is that they had to experience a forced career change. And hey, we see this for all different reasons. We see it with changes in technology, and jobs become obsolete, and those jobs are discontinued, and something else takes its place, either something that involves a different type of technology or something like that. It could be a lot of different things though. So for instance, let's just look at the last 50 years, okay? So, and this is just in my own lifetime, all right? So when I think about it, when I was a child, I was in a small central Pennsylvania town, and every Saturday night we would drive downtown and walk up and down the sidewalks and look in the store windows, go shopping if we needed to, and everything that we needed was in little shops along Main Street in that small town. Eventually, they built a mall outside of town in what used to be farmers' fields. And before I knew it, either the shops downtown had moved to the mall or they had been replaced by a chain of stores that sells something similar. So I would say within 10 years, most of the stores were going out of business in that small town. There were still some stores that were open, like an office supply store and things like that. But soon after the malls opened, then what we call big box stores began to be built. And so one of them was like an office supply store. So, and then they got into competition with each other. So you have Staples, Office Max, and maybe another one. But normally the competition between them was so heavy, either one of them prevailed in one area or one took over nationally. And you'll see this in a lot of different areas of the country. So, and then the mall was supposed to recreate the small town in an indoor environment. However, many of the people who maybe had a family business for years and years no longer had that business downtown. And it was replaced by something in the mall. And then we started big box stores, and they specialized at first, like for office supplies or other things. But eventually, we had stores like Kmart and Walmart, and Walmart eventually grew into super Walmarts. And then we had things like club stores like Costco or Sam's Club. And between Walmart and Sam's and Costco, a lot of the business was taken away from the malls. The last thing that happened was the internet. Okay, so I remember when there was no Amazon, and I mainly used the internet for email and communicating with people, and then I used it to download references and things like that, and everything was free. But it wasn't long until somebody figured out I can sell things on the internet, and that came with the invention of Mozilla. Okay, so Mozilla was basically a web browser, and it gave people easy access to individual sites without having to type in commands. So as soon as they invented Mozilla, the internet of sales took off. Now at the beginning, all of these individual stores would try to sell you something, and you would have to buy from different stores and they would mail it to you. However, what changed was, of course, Amazon. All right, so Amazon, you only had to go to one site. Now, eventually, originally, Amazon, all of those stores that you could find on Amazon would still ship directly from that store. But then Amazon began having its own inventory, building its own warehouses, and it became the distributor. And that's what got us kind of where we are today. And that closed the rest of the large malls. I know just last year, I think the last store at Century 3 Mall closed. It was kind of eerie going through there before then because, you know, Night of the Living Dead was filmed in Pittsburgh, and that's kind of like what it made me feel like going through Century 3 the last few months. But it would be nice if we could repurpose malls into living communities for the elderly, living communities for people with special needs, community resource centers. There's so much available space, but most of the corporations that own the malls began using them as tax deductions, and then they became dilapidated, and now you can't use them for much of anything. So now, many of the small downtowns are not as vibrant. Many of the malls are closed, and we've moved a lot online. This not only does away with jobs over the last 50 years, but it causes people, so let's say you had a small business downtown and it closed, that was going to be your life career, okay? But if that had to close and then you went out to get a job at the mall, you're probably making minimum wage in retail, and it's not the same as owning or working in a small business where you could support yourself and a family. And then it changes even further from retail to the big box stores to Amazon. And eventually it would be very difficult to have more than just a job, to hold on to that with some sense of security and have a long-term career, not only financially, but something that is fulfilling. All right. And of course, we're getting people coming to career counseling after every one of those changes, okay? And I'm sure we're not done yet. It happens all the time. Anybody have any stories or questions or comments? Yeah.
I do. I was thinking while you were talking about this stuff about how the pandemic has probably influenced a lot of this stuff, and maybe people who are interested in career counseling will encounter, or even just regular counseling, encounter people that have maybe had to shift their meaning of what type of career jobs they want after being forced to not work, or maybe their business is closing.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge. And you kind of foresaw one of my last chapters on current issues, you know, which is great.
We'll go back, we'll get to
That's
that.
good. No, but that's good. So when we think about it, with every one of these big changes, there's pros and cons, there's positives and negatives. So for instance, this giant shift with the pandemic, we're experiencing technology and career change right now as we speak. So in some sense it was good because it forced everyone to look at us now. We're using video conferencing. I mean, every student in this class has access to it. That just wasn't as common before. People might sit in like a business conference room and do video conferencing, or if somebody was like overseas or far away and I needed to talk with them. The big thing that changed video conferencing was Facetime, but nobody really used Facetime for business. It was more like a hey, let's see the grandkids, you know? But now it's ubiquitous. I know that CalU would probably not have bought this OWL system if we weren't forced to. We had an online platform, D2L, and it was working, but it wasn't live. It wasn't the same feel or experience. But it also, all of this also had some downfalls, you know? People, it was very, in some sense, it was nice if people could work from home, but in another sense, maybe people couldn't work from home, but they no longer had childcare. Okay, so that was an extra issue to deal with. Large percentage of people did not have jobs. So it was both, anytime we go through a major change, it's both a struggle and a benefit for some and not others. Yeah.
I know when I work with students to find internships in the internship center, one of the, like, it's just a new question we have to ask is remote or in person. It's just kind of like I have like my checklist that I keep in my head of like, you know, location. Do you want to stay local or do you want to travel? Do you want to be around here or do you want it in person or remote? It was just another thing that we had to kind of talk about on top of like, what do you like to do? What's your college major? Where do you want to live or whatever? It was, do you want to be remote? Which like for some people,
How do you, tell us about what do you think the reactions are now to that?
I found it beneficial, I think, because if they're open to it and like if it's the possibility now that they have that it just became another option. So for me, like there was a young lady who was in banking and she was looking to intern, but in this area she was from South America. A lot of them didn't want to sponsor her for her internship. Um, and so, but then I found a bunch of internships in New York City that were doing remote internships that would sponsor her. And so I think maybe she wouldn't have had that opportunity. Or there's students who are in the computer programming program at Cal, and they have the opportunity to, you know, intern at a company in Silicon Valley. Maybe they wouldn't have had that opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, those are good examples. How about like, have you found anything that was detrimental, that was not positive?
Um, I just on my end, no, because we don't do like a follow up of how the experience was. And I think maybe that's like, it sounds really great in theory. I feel like for some of them, maybe they were really excited about that opportunity. And then they got into the working from home remote process and they were like, I'm not meeting any people. I'm not really like, because I've even found when I did internships in New York, even after that internship ended, so many kind of business relationships or whatever were cultivated in like the coffee break room or whatever, or just walk into my office or whatever. And you don't really get that when you're like even just sitting at home, because it's, oh, I have a meeting, I'm going to the meeting, then I'm clicking leave. You don't get that lingering hanging out small talk.
Yeah, and you know, I was wondering, is it just because of my age, you know, or is it because maybe I'm a social person, you know? But I mean, really, I found it very lonely, you know, because I do like hanging out with people, you know, students or colleagues, you know, and that's kind of part of my meaningful experience.
My husband started a new job during the pandemic and he's been working remote and he has never met any of his coworkers in person.
Wow.
And so that we always discuss how bizarre that is.
Yeah.
It's so strange.
Yeah. When we started this new program, Tavera, when we moved from live text to Tavera for this program, we would log on to Zoom. It was during the pandemic. And we were talking with somebody in England once a week. And, you know, but it could have been anywhere. Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah. All right, excellent, excellent, good job. So that's our first lecture. Okay, so the second thing I'd like to do is I have to take roll, but we also need to come up with partners for our project. All right, so I normally don't take a break, but I have to go get my roster. So go ahead, take a 5-minute, you know, bathroom break, get a snack, whatever, and I'll just keep this running, okay? But I'm going to stop the recording.